Alright, welcome to Warrenworks. Today is another episode of my 52 cards in 52 weeks challenge. Last week I drew this Jack of Clubs which says Diresta Skeleton Knife. So today we're going to be making a handle for this. I picked up this Diresta Skeleton Knife a while back and I've been wanting to make a handle, and I thought I would take some design ideas from the Diresta ice pick itself, as that's made from a piece of brass headstock, and I've always thought that was a cool idea, so I thought I would make a bigger version of that same style handle for the knife. Now, I thought I was going to mill a pocket into the handle of the knife with my lathe. This is not a milling machine, but I clamped this little vise on here and had planned to mill a pocket so you could still see the Diresta logo. However, I realized the center of the chuck was way lower than the center of the workpiece, so there was no way that this was going to work without some severe modification. So I decided to use my table saw, and I put in a really cheap blade. And brass is soft enough that you can cut it with the table saw, but you got to be careful because it's just really messy, and you want to take really light passes. This first pass was probably a little bit too heavy, and I am using a saw stop, but I had to disengage the brake because otherwise I'll set the brake off as I'm cutting a piece of metal. And like I said, I'm just using a really junky blade here because it still has carbide teeth, but I didn't want to ruin one of my nicer blades. And this did work. I just took a lot of light passes and was able to carve out a big section. And then I tilted the blade over, and you'll see I'm going to cut this kind of interesting shape to accept the knife handle. And once that little piece was out, I have kind of a recess that the knife handle will sit into. And then I can cut sort of a dado into the top that the knife will lock into. I did this just taking a couple passes, moving the fence over a little bit at a time. And you can see here how the knife will just slide right into that groove. And I ended up actually cutting that a little bit deeper so the blade would go a little bit farther up. And then I cut this little piece to kind of match that same profile on the top. And cutting this little piece was a little bit tricky. I just had to use a couple push sticks to do so. And then I unfortunately did this. Look at that. I did it. Stupidly turned my saw on without even thinking about it and ran the piece of brass right into it and set the brake off. Of course I had the camera off, but I ran that piece through and forgot to disengage the brake. I wish I hadn't done that. Now I know that this actually works because I've never done it before. Thankfully I kept an extra brake cartridge on hand in case that ever happened, and sure enough it did. So I set the height of the blade to the same thickness of the knife, and I can cut out a little groove out of this other little piece of brass. Sorry, my head was kind of in the way there. But then I used that same little vise that I put on the lathe earlier, and I was just using this to hold the brass in place so I could file it and get a nice smooth finish to get all those saw blade marks out. There was probably a good 2 hours of filing for this whole project, and I only filmed about 30 seconds. I could cut this little tang off to fit around the blade too. And I just did that with a hacksaw because it was a small enough piece that's easy enough to just cut with a hacksaw. This little vise was really handy. I don't know where this came from. I picked it up with a bunch of machinist tools a while back. And having a little work holding device like that for projects like this is really great. I'm sure you could find something like that on Marketplace or eBay. Or even make one yourself. Then I clamped the handle into the vise with that little bottom piece. And I actually welded the brass back together. I used some silicon bronze rod here. I'm pretty new to welding brass, but I am learning, and it does work pretty well. It makes for a real nasty weld. Once the metal gets hot enough to melt, it spatters quite a bit. And you just kind of have to get in there and dump the rod in to make it work. But it does work, and then once you grind it out, it grinds out really nicely, actually. And it looks just like a solid piece of brass. You don't see any staining or anything like that. And I couldn't be happier with the way that actually works out. And then I wanted to cut the end off, so I had a nice cross section on the end where you can see the brass and the stainless. And then I used just my little belt sander here to clean up the saw mark in the back side of that. And then I ran around with a file just to knock over the edges and give it a little bit more of a rounded feel. And once that was done, I went over to my polishing wheel and just polished this thing out. I didn't get a full mirror polish, but I wanted to get it pretty close. And I am really, really happy with how this thing came out. I think it's a really cool piece to have, and I'm happy to finally have made my own skeleton knife version. And I liked the idea of taking, or kind of giving homage to the Diresta ice pick, because Diresta is the man. And then of course I had to actually test it out, and it works great. Alright, well that was a lot of fun. I think this thing is pretty neat. And obviously inspired by the Diresta Knife pick. Whoops. And I think it was a cool project. But with that, I'm going to pick my card for next week. Jack of Diamonds, charging station. Alright, well, next week I'll be building a charging station, so come on back for that. And as always, thank you for watching.